Um, Thank you all. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this speaker series. It's an honor to be among such an impressive list of scholars working in and around studies of children and art. My voice is still recovering from a cold, so I apologize for its roughness and the brief pauses that I will have to take to rehydrate during this presentation. The work that I will be talking about today stems from a study of children's drawing practices in environmental learning settings conducted over several years, but its origins began long before. Since 2014, I have variously worked in and collaborated with the Science Museum in the Southwestern United States, which provided me the supportive environment that first allowed me to explore diverse areas of interest in education, from art to science to environment, and leading experimental forays with children into the surrounding river valley and collaborating with local partners. For me, these experiences in part catalyzed an endless stream of questions about the ways we learn and learn to inhabit places, questions that I believe have ever more critical importance in the present precarious times of environmental degradation and climate crisis. So today I'll share a data story that occurred during one of these learning endeavors. In this case, it's a science-informed, arts-integrated environmental day camp hosted at a local regenerative agricultural farm. In an attempt to grasp the extraordinary events that unfolded, I turned to biosemiotics, the communication that occurs across and among diverse life forms. And so I'll begin by taking you into the garden on a bright fall day. It is morning, and I am tagging along with some children into a vegetable garden. The air is crisp, lightened of its summer heaviness, and with it, the thrum of insect life traded for the trailing honks of geese and rattling calls of freshly arrived cranes. The garden, once a verdant nursery of tender plants, has taken on the mature patina of the season, greens turning to yellow, curling to brown. Tucked beneath the leaves, the last of the summer abundance overripens on the soft edge of rot. The children skip among the rows of planter boxes, energized by sunshine and eager to discover the half-forgotten fruits weighing down the tomato plants, not minding at all the beans gone dry and pithy, the onions now only sporting the delicate architecture of their once purple blooms. Reaching small fingers to pluck perfectly red globes, the children quickly instruct each other to leave the tomatoes guarded by fat grasshoppers, clinging motionless and perfectly matched in greens except for their huge obsidian eyes. The grasshoppers look back at you, a child remarks. Squash leaves sweep our legs and hands as we walk by. Our fingers reach out, pushing aside the prickly leaves to peer into the shade to find elongated fruits, deep green and pale yellow with dry yellow crowns, tucked among the base of the plants. But Layla, 6 years old with pigtails and rain boots, pauses in the canopy of leaves, gently grasping the thin, rough membranes between thumb and forefinger. Something of this plant being has caught her attention as surely as leaf prickles catch on skin. So this is a story that illustrates what Eduardo Kohn calls an ecology of selves, or the sign interactions of beings banded together in a complex web of relations. In this case, it's a story about drawings animated by sign-mediated interactions between and among child and plant. Biosemiotics, the study of sign communication between life forms, guides my endeavor to understand a child's drawing event as a creative manifestation of agency and knowing in a co-evolved world. A biosemiotic approach stems from the idea of Umwelt, or life world. The subjective perceptual realm of an organism is simultaneously afforded by their sensory capacities and the panoply of modalities available to them and to make meaning from their environments. Recognition of an organism's embodied affordances to represent and make meaning redefines notions of agency and knowing as intrinsic to life and thoroughly woven into a world teeming with semiotic activity. Today, I'll focus on the emergence of signs and multiple modes of communication, including drawing, language, and gesture, used by the child, Layla, to express and describe her encounter with a squash plant, while considering the sign communications already at play within the ecology of the garden. I consider how abductive inference, the early logic of discovery, metaphor, and hypothesis making, compels and carries forward the processes of learning, creativity, and growth. And I argue that the event of Layla's drawing is both brought about by and coterminous with semiosis beyond the human. An ecological understanding is useful for examining the multivariate ways in which drawing comes into existence, as is recognizing organisms as capable makers and interpretants of meanings across forms and contexts important for tracing human semiosis. In exploring the continuum of semiosis from biology to culture as revealed through a child's drawing event, I rely upon key contributions made by anthropologist Eduardo Kohn and semiotician Wendy Wheeler to analyze and illuminate the emergence of human evolved habits and thoughts from a world already thickly immersed in conversation. Kohn drew upon Peircean semiotics to explain how all beings can represent, produce, and interpret signs, arguing that the world is not simply a matter of biological and ecological processes, but common semiosis drawn from communication between life forms. Wheeler's theorization of the continuity of patterns in nature culture provides further grounding for aesthetic development. Organisms, she reasons, find meaning in being and becoming aware of these patterns. Human semiosis is merely a species-specific articulation of patterns made apparent in different forms of imagining, language, or drawing, for instance. In considering the agency of non-humans to represent and communicate, biosemiotics leads multi-species and post-human discourse from the epistemological, or how humans might think about non-humans, to the ontological, and that there are other kinds of thinking entities beyond the human. Kohn and Wheeler were concerned with the distinctive characteristics that make up all living beings, that is, selves who have a point of view, and their intrinsic agency to not just be represented, but to represent. This is not to claim that all beings experience phenomena similarly, even when they share phenotypes, or to suggest a standardization or typology for what qualifies as representation, but instead recognize and affirm diverse participation within the semiosphere. By approaching the occurrence of drawing from a biosemic perspective, I do not aim to equate human thoughts with plant thoughts, or even all human thoughts as alike. Rather, by attending to the potentialities of representation beyond the human, I seek a realignment of learning and knowing as constituted by and having social and ecological consequences. That other kinds of beings can and do represent, know, and even think changes how we humans think of human affairs, including education, and how we go about studying them, because it means the human experience cannot be understood isolated from our multi-species world. It means, as Wheeler argued, that all life, including human culture, is naturally co-evolved and interdependent. In telling and analyzing this data story, I take as inspiration Kohn's beyond the human anthropological study of the Runa people in Amazonian Ecuador, an exploration of the ways in which humans and non-humans become aware of each other and the emergent modes of relating that develop between them. Kohn's interest in the Runa and the relationship with the rainforest was underpinned by a desire to move beyond the dualistic approach of the study of humans, the way in which Western logic and scholarship has traditionally portrayed humans as separate from the rest of nature. He reasoned that the heightened density of non-human beings that make up the forest amplifies the semiotic quality of life and makes it more apparent to study. I take a similar approach by following the children into a vegetable garden in the early autumn, where a convergence of species flourishes and opportunities for an array of unbelten to overlap multiplies. My interest lies in what insights about relating, learning, and knowing become apparent when drawing is understood to be part of an ongoing multi-species conversation. I first explore the perspective that biosemiotics affords of selves and their biological and cultural origins, then the utility of Peircean semiotic methods, before returning to the garden to consider this multi-species exchange. So biosemiotics investigates the use of signs within and between organisms. The concept of biosemiotics draws on biologist Jacob von Uexküll's theory of Umwelt, which aims to explain the phenomenal or embodied worlds that organisms experience and the transcendental or relational process of interpreting the world in which they are inextricably embedded. One's Umwelt or life world is based on species-specific capabilities and the unique context of experience. Umwelten are comprised of signs, or as Kohn put it, life is constitutively semiotic. Signs as anything which can be interpreted and thus gives meaning, form, and inform life. Accordingly, organisms are immersed in sign-based conversations, from genetic to cellular, behavioral to habitual, ecological to cultural. Life's forms and habits are a tangled lineage of signs. One sign emitted and received give rise to another, and so on. Living beings do not just contribute to these open, nested conversations, they emerge from them as selves. A self is the outcome of living process, an embodiment of biological discourse and manifestation of one's interpretation of the surrounding world. Selfhood is imbued by the semantic dynamic itself, in which a new sign is produced by interpretation of a prior one. This triadic relationship is key. Signs must stand for something, for somebody, a self. Kohn, drawing on Peirce, referred to signs as thoughts to indicate learning and growth, maintaining that selves can learn by experience and thereby grow in new ways. Selves think by producing and interpreting signs. All thoughts relate to one another. They live and grow insofar as they can learn by experience and come to be interpreted by a subsequent sign in the possible future. Positing signs as thoughts implies knowing. Even at the cellular level, even for the simplest organisms, life holds the capacity to some degree for recognition, intention, and evaluation. Selves act on their own behalf. They respond to hospitable or inhospitable events in their surroundings and generate structures and processes that favor their persistence. A plant, for example, may knowingly stretch itself toward light for sustenance, its ability and efficiency to do so availed by embodied knowledge gained incrementally across many generations to optimize the capture of light. What this means is all living things possess knowing as some form of agency, some capacity for making sense of things, and some feeling for meaning. Nature's innovations arise from the adaptation and creativity induced by context and chance, and processes better described as relational and poetic than linear or mechanistic. Patterns and forms in nature characterize biological and cultural stories, playing out in various becomings over time. Natural evolution, and as Wheeler contended, the emergence of the human aesthetic sense. Aesthetics have to do with what is felt and perceived, and embodied in worldedness that conjures interpretation and meaning, compels adaptation and growth. Aesthetics are a process of making, an inventive capacity by which we humans shape ourselves and our Umwelten. An ecology of knowing selves, as afforded by species Umwelten and the comprising dialogic relations, is the basis of my understanding of living things as the children and I move through the garden. The verdant garden, soon to give over into winter repose, is natural poetry, the unfolding of signs and meanings in the processes of time. The articulation of language and drawing as aesthetic sense shared among us humans is a continuum of nature's sign patterns, communication architected by our biological evolution, and set off in new directions by chance and creativity. Peircean semantic method provides the expansive frame needed to rethink representation and inference as necessarily human traits. The triadic semantic structure consists of sign, object, and interpretant. The sign is the medium through which meaning is conveyed, and the object is the aspect of the world that the sign is meant to represent, and the interpretant is the understanding generated by the relation between the sign and object. For example, a curved line drawn is a sign which refers to a leaf, which is the object, and thereby an appreciative grasp of plant anatomy or the interpretant. But consider too that the curve of the leaf is the interpretant of the physics of a raindrop and represents the plant's existential need for water. The sign carries meaning through its mutual relationship to the object and the interpretant. Signs, according to Peirce, may be classified into three primary categories based on their relation to the object, with increasing conceptual complexity: icon, index, and symbol. An icon, the most basic and indispensable sign processes, works by its intrinsic likeness to something to develop direct association with an object. It imitates or bears resemblance to the object it designates, an image of a plant, for instance, or the viridian shades of a grasshopper coordinated to the leaves of a tomato plant. An index points to something other than itself, providing information about something that may not be immediately present. For example, the skeletal flower heads of onions gone to seed point to seasonal change. Indices layer iconic associations to reveal something about context and conditions. Moreover, they focus attention on the junction between experiences. And symbols, so far as we know them, are distinctly human created. They are conventionally or arbitrarily linked to what they represent, an imagined association between an utterance, a sound, or a mark, and linked to an aspect of the world. Language is fundamentally symbolic, using words, gestures, and sounds to represent ideas and concepts. Symbols are abstractions, but they emerge from and relate to the other modalities of representation. But maybe most interestingly, mark making, such as drawing, can be symbolic, but it can also be iconic and indexical too. Observing signs leads to inference and interpretation. Peirce distinguished three types of inference: deduction, induction, and abduction. Deduction relies on the logic of established science systems to surmise a specific and invariable conclusion, whereas induction generalizes from observations and constructs an operative conclusion. Abduction, on the other hand, does not seek to arrive at a conclusion. It merely suggests that something may be. Not relying on extant knowledge or bound to elucidate an observed phenomenon, abduction is the tentative, inquisitive bridge to new knowledge. According to Peirce, abduction is perception triggered by doubt, curiosity, or astonishment to realize an unexpected property of an object or event. Sternfeld further suggests that this revelation requires a co-localization of icon and index to focus attention and constrain the possibilities to an object that could have this feeling, quality, or property. A hypothesis can thus be generated, an informed but imaginative supposition that may be explored through further inquiry or action. Abduction can also be metaphor, as Wheeler pointed out. Abduction is a figurative movement of one meaning to another, where the play between similarity and difference is facilitated by the relations between things. Sufficient similarity allows for transposition of meaning, but recognizing the difference in context or location introduces new meaning or function. Metaphor propels the growth of meanings, as things can be both what they are and also something else at the same time. Importantly, abductively interpreting and acting upon signs are not sole properties of human consciousness or expression. Other essential features of abduction include instinct or inherited disposition or habits that may be modified by a new experience, and multimodality or discernment and representation of sensory and kinesthetic information. These are capacities innately held by plants, fungi, and non-human animals, and actively applied to respond, anticipate, adapt, and contribute to conditions and stimuli within their respective Umwelten. Cohn provided a framework for describing sign interactions occurring through forms of communication beyond human semiosis, one that is observant of the constant mutations of perception into thought, into action, and into habit. Returning now to the garden and the activities unfolding there, I explore semiotic exchanges that occur across Umwelten and the inferential activity expressed through diverse modalities, including drawing. And I attempt to show how these signs are, in ways embodied and metaphorical, communication that is in and of the world. Lingering in the leaves, Layla grasps a yellowing leaf of the squash, crushing it gently between her fingers. The sensation seems to puzzle her, and she leans in, steadying herself on the wooden frame of the planter box. It feels like the thought aspirates into the air. As I watch Layla puzzle at the texture of the leaf in her hand, I too reach for a leaf of a nearby squash. A delicate layer of stiff, crystalline hairs coats the squash leaves. To the fingertip, they feel finely abrasive, like the hook side of Velcro. Trichomes, as the hair-like structures are known, tell of things known but not immediately present, a shared ancestry with other plants, a deft management strategy of sun, temperature, and water, a cultural lineage of agricultural domesticity, an ongoing struggle against ravenous critters. Trichomes, in this case, come to signify something not in their likeness, mammalian hairs perhaps, or Velcro, but in that they point to intersecting experiences. In this moment, at the slowing end of the season, the translucent hair-like structures are loosening from their leafy substrates, becoming dry and brittle to the touch. To an intrepid larva or beetle, a trichome-covered leaf holds different meaning. This is cumbersome and potentially treacherous terrain. A critter, having felt its movement hindered or the misfortune of being snagged on the point of a trichome, might learn to interpret similarly sharp structures as a sign of discomfort or danger and come to see the prickliness of plant flesh as a potentially hazardous path and redirect its journey. Here, iconic associations layer up to produce an index, where the insect's route or absence from the plant becomes indications of the efficacy of a plant's defenses. Layla, meanwhile, casts about, searching for her own iconic associations. The curious texture of a leaf under fingertip has snagged her attention, not entirely unlike how an arthropod might be caught up, though with less bodily danger. Layla's brow furrows and she peers at the underside of the leaf. What is this sensation, and what might it share with things felt before? I just can't find the word, she says. Ada, younger by a year, stoops to touch another leaf of the same plant. Watery, she offers. Layla thinks. The sensation she feels appears to be functioning at what Pierce calls a thunderbolt, something that has happened that startles us into noticing, but precisely what has happened is not yet known. Wait, Layla starts. When I press on it, I feel like like salt or something coming in, like she gazes into the distance, rubbing her fingers together slowly. Watery? Salt? I press firmly on the leaf I hold in my hand, and I feel an ever so slight give in the surface, a small but crisply perceptible collapse between my fingertips. Releasing the leaf, I can indeed feel a grainy residue on my fingers. Ada concurs. Yeah, it feels like salt, like there is actually salt on your hand. Perhaps movement plays a role in activating this phenomenon. Layla thinks out loud. Maybe when the bug, moves a lot, she wriggles her body. It probably squishes and the salt goes into the bug, and she jabs at her own abdomen, mimicking the way in which she imagines a roving plant, garden pest, triggering the defense system of the plant. A hypothesis is beginning to form, because salt kills bugs. Exactly what the granular residue is yet unknown, but Layla understands that there are possibilities linked to the biology of the plant and of the hypothetical bug, and that there is a relationship between the two. She reaches for the plant leaves again, speaking softly, so that's another way to protect itself. Hours later, the day has warmed and we return to the garden, this time toting small notebooks and pencils and a handful of markers. A morning session peering through microscopes at plant flesh and other specimens collected from around the garden has primed us for careful looking. This time, the children readily inspect withering vines and fading leaves, comparing their plumper, brighter counterparts, jotting down their observations with illustrative drawings. In the dark soil tucked under the plants, tiny critters roam. Layla offers the tip of her finger to roly-poly, which is a colloquial name for a common small terrestrial crustacean, and it climbs aboard. She perches on the edge of the planter box, watching the roly-poly roam around the train of her palm. In her notebook, she draws in marker a curved oblong shape with a fringe of legs, a single eye, and a slight bend of a smile. Next to this, a frilly leaf atop a long stem and two arrows, one pointing leaf to critter and the other critter to leaf. I'm just like saying that roly-polies live here, she explains to me, and I am doubly struck by the sense of confidence in her inference of the adjacent, if not entwined, habits of roly-polies and squash, and her expertise at managing the layered nuances of drawing semiotics to explain this, as seen here in her drawing. Kneeling carefully to place the critter back in the soil under the crisp leaves, Layla returns to puzzling over the squash leaves, feeling her way across leaves green and yellowing and one's bleached white like bone. She crumples a yellowed leaf again and again inspects her hand. Peering under the broad leaves, suddenly Layla gasps. I absorbed something, she announces. What did you absorb? I ask, amused at her word choice and impressed by her acute awareness of herself as a learner. The squash has a little plant on it. It has a flower, she says, pointing to a drooping blossom. Turning back to her notebook, she draws an oblong circle crowned with a fluffy triangle. Did you look at squash flowers earlier? I asked, thinking back to the prior microscope session. But Layla has already moved ahead. I was absorbing about roly-polies. Now I'm absorbing about, she pauses. Our game that we're playing? Ada interjects, hopeful. Layla shakes her head and crosses one knee over the other to better balance her notebook. I'm absorbing about squash, she says confidently. So, Layla sits up a little straighter, ready to lay her knowledge on me. Mostly they grow flowers, and how they look dead is like this. She motions to the wilted flowers sprouting from the base of the plant. She holds up her notebook. This is a picture of a squash and a dead flower, she explains, circling the drawing with the back end of her marker. And this, she draws another circle and crown, a little smaller this time. That's a live flower. Signs represented by the plant, its reproduction process and tendency toward entropy, are sensed, then mediated to become another and another sign relation. What Layla has derived from observing the plants, it seems, is not only their biological habit to produce flowers and fruit, but that they too experience time and cycles of life which manifest corporeally, and the intersection between these. Her desire to relay this information to me abducts or carries this knowledge further into human-based modalities, language, drawing, along with gesture. Still, something unresolved remains. A curiosity beckons. Layla looks pensive, thinking, something pushing at the edge of her thought. And every time you squish, she draws a fatly lobed leaf in the corner of the page. Salt bursts out. She adds an arrow pointing to the leaf shape and a radiating halo of lines. Like her early diagrammatic drawing of roly-poly's relationship to squash, Layla simulates the leaf shape and employs the common symbol of an arrow to draw attention to the location of this marvel. The emanating lines do sign double duty, indicating and imitating the rupture. Again, a pause. Layla leans toward the plant, finding leaves with her fingers. When the plant is white, she quickly draws a four-fingered shape and briefly turns the notebook toward me with a shy grin. It's sometimes white, and that's where the salt is, but sometimes she searches the bristling row of plants. Like you see, she bends a wide green leaf speckled with white toward me. There's less salt where the green is. Layla plunks down again on the planter bed's edge, an intense expression on her face. But there's more salt, and it bursts out where the white part is. She hunches over her notebook, face close to the paper, marker gripped tightly at its base, adding to her drawing. A large, emphatic dot, stubby lines bursting forth, and another arrow. In becoming witness to an array of signs already operating at cellular, organismal, and environmental levels, Layla is drawn into interpreting signs emitted by other selves, which in turn generate new signs. Sign processes start with affiliating icons, layer up to become indices, and may convolutedly become symbols. As Wheeler wrote, natural metaphors and natural stories gradually evolve into cultural metaphors and cultural stories. The garden, with its many layers of co-evolved life forms, amplifies the tendencies toward habit and crafts new ones. Of the countless thoughts and habits unfolding on this bright fall day, Layla's drawing is but one aesthetic relation emerging from this place. Culture plays a role, certainly, in setting the stage for practices of looking and privileging certain information and types of knowledge over others. The overarching science-informed, arts-integrated values of the learning setting, that is, establishing practices to observe and identify patterns in the world and to describe the phenomena using various forms of communication, have clearly permeated Layla's young mind. She understands that in this cultural context, she is supposed to be a student, a learner, and what do learners do? They absorb information. Her use of this word, as in, I absorb something, in relation to her realization about squash way of being signals to her ascent into the performance expected of her as a learner. Admittedly, this kind of enthusiasm for learning on the part of the learner, as it is happening nonetheless, is something hardworking educators crave, but perhaps this gives humans and the structures we have built too much credit. Surely, the unfolding of new signs cannot be attributed wholly to the conventions and expectations of the modern paradigm of education. Imaginably, it was the fascination, the not knowing, that kept Layla coming back to the squash plants. The meaning of the sign was incomplete, and that is what drove the interpretants forward. After the flash of abduction, the search for meaning in the signed object, it seems, buoyed her curiosity, mobilized her reasoning, and carried her desire to communicate further. Seeking meaning in this strange new phenomenon not just catalyzed her search, but sustained it, sharpened it. Attempting to mediate the sign relation required Layla to draw upon sensory attentiveness and imaginative abstraction, to wonder about the habits and relations of other species, and in doing so, acquire a new way of perceiving the world. Curiosity, like creativity, grows from the world. Credit must also be given to the plants, the roly-polies, and the host of semiotic selves inhabiting the garden. As semiotic-capable organisms, they too participate in model semiotic activity. As Cohen explored with the Runa people and the various life forms in the surrounding rainforest, the sign-making habits of the world have everything to do with how we, humans in all their life, know the world. Layla's learning turned on imagining how squash plants and arthropods understand the world around them. She tried to imagine what would be meaningful to them. What would endanger a plant? How might it protect itself? What would discourage a bug? Thinking along these lines is not a leap toward anthropomorphism, but rather recognition that learning is ecological as well as social. The environment in which the learning occurs has bearing on somatic activities because, as Oltiano and Stables maintained, learning is neither specifically human nor contained by human-specific somatic resources. Layla's thoughts, that is, her learning and growth, depended on encountering and relating to other non-human thoughts. Layla's display, or rather embodiment, of thought points to the significance of body in growing cognitive capacity. As unbuilt theory would suggest, the body is a crucial prerequisite for somatic articulation. Every experience is written onto, into, and by the body, as Sternfeld asserted, yet representing these experiences with words, symbols, and icons, drawn or otherwise, cannot fully express what the body senses and interprets. For instance, it was the brush of rough leaves on tender skin that first intrigued Layla, and it was the very same tactility that fueled and informed her prolonged sense-making. Layla is very good at translating from one modality to another, but still, parts of the experience slip unarticulated between sensation and expression. Words and images escape her in attempting to describe what she feels in her body, and therefore what she knows. I would argue this is not for lack of experience or knowledge on the child's part, but simply that there is more to our knowing that our human modalities can even express. Cognitive capacity proceeds from evolutionary inheritance, meaning our ability to sense and respond to the world precedes our ability to talk about it. Learning is not a purely mental process, but rather is linked to sensing physical change. What Layla appears to know is that in touching the plant, she affects it in some way. Conversely, through the reciprocity of touch, the plant affects Layla. This simple connection, derived from bodily sensation, is profound, prompting a cascade of inference and interpretation, observable at least on the child's part. In her drawing, The Act and the Artifact, Layla uses the felt sensation as the root of her aesthetic, going so far as to emulate the experience in her mark making. In the final moments of her drawing, she wields the marker with an intensity that imitates the physicality of the exchange. Touch applied here provokes a perceptible change in the world. The marker, pushed hard to saturate the paper, seems meant to recreate the rush of sensation, to relive the palpable moment of discovery of another's way of being. The exchange lingers in the brittle residue left on the child's fingers and in the metaphor of her drawing. Is it possible to know what sign communications might come to mean for the other life forms inhabiting the garden? While sign communication is easily observable in the human animal, and with some humility recognized in other animals, the boundaries of the human senses and ideologies may contribute to a lack of knowledge of other possible instances of semiosis beyond the human, particularly among and by plants. A biosomatic understanding emphasizes the processual aspects of semiosis, which vary in tempos and scales across organisms and environments. Signification for non-human organisms may be a change or difference brought about by one's involvement in the sign relation. This means signs inherited from biological lineage, such as leaf shape and vegetal defenses, appear to be contextual or seemingly constant and fixed, and less perceptible than other aspects that may be directly modified by the organism. In other words, determining if and how somatic activity has occurred has less to do with the capacity of the organism in question and more to do with the limitations of the observer. This leaves open the possibility of simultaneous discovery. Perhaps the plants and the arthropods, too, experience transformation in their knowing upon encountering the human child. Despite our subjectivities and inherent limitations of unbuilt, our common origins and overlapping unbuilt provide pathways for knowing something of other selves. Kant insisted that we can know something of what it is like to be non-human because all thoughts relate to one another. This is true, he maintained, however mediated, provisional, fallible, and tenuous those understandings might be, because we are all living, growing thoughts. In this way, what is so compelling about Layla's chance experience in the garden is not the scientific accuracy of her guesses or the aesthetics of her drawings, but that these constitute an attempt to imagine the world from the perspective of another. A sign, as stated before, is anything which can be interpreted and thus gives meaning. Put another way, what makes anything a sign is the attention paid to it. A garden, a plant, a drawing may be seen without it acting as a sign, certainly, but look at a garden, a plant, or a drawing with fresh interest, and it may surface new meaning or awareness. This attention can, in turn, spiral into new signs and new habits of thinking and doing. Mere attention, Wheeler noted, kicks off the entire semiotic process. Opportunities for sign abound in the world, but it is only when we turn our attention to them that they become meaningful and that they can take shape within our habits and lives. In the same way, we may look at an endeavor of education and reflect upon many different aspects of learning. Whichever aspect we reflect upon, the semiotic object will appear in a particular way and elicit something else in our thinking or behavior. Just as Layla repeatedly devoted attention to the aspects of the squash as a living being, which subsequently provoked changes in her thought and action, my attention to the event of her drawing, as architected by both biological and cultural patterns, produces a different understanding of its unfolding, one that likewise flows out of the hum of the garden. Attending to the potentiality for semiosis beyond the human opens the phenomenon of learning, and thus knowing, as imbued by the multi-species world in which we all live. To take a biosemantic view of children's drawing is to attempt a more capacious, less anthropocentric understanding of what it is to know and how one might arrive at knowledge. Signs, as Winford Newt contended, are educators, meaning that we learn from the existence, communication, and interpretation of sign. If, as Pierce suggested and Cohn and Wheeler underscored, all living beings are sign-producing cells who relate to one another, then we are all actively linked in hermeneutical exchange. To expand the semiosphere to include the biosphere is to reimagine human education as intimately interwoven into interspecies interaction and agency, as inseparable from our shared natural history as our biology. Recognizing that other beings can and do interpret and interact with the world in meaningful ways, and even in common, deeply human impacted spaces such as a vegetable garden, and in doing so make possible and otherwise human affairs such as drawing, expands the endeavor of human knowledge as necessarily entwined with non-human beings. Semiotic forces are and always have been at work in the world. As Donna Haraway reminded, becoming is always becoming with. This ancient imperative of our mutual affinities weighs heavily as we teeter on converging precipices of mass species extinction and simulated intelligence. What will ways of knowing become in a world emptied of its biodiversity and effectively mediated by machines? What sparks of curiosity will be foreclosed by the sheer loss of everyday opportunity for embodied encounters between human and non-human? What meandering paths of inference and inquiry will be stymied by inattention and stunted cognitive process? We can scarcely imagine the vacuum that this will create in our own habits and lives, let alone those of the life forms beyond the human. And so my interest in looking at drawing as a biosemiotic event is less about what semiotic beings are communicating and more about the intrinsic possibility for growth encoded in all of us. Given the opportunity to flourish through embodied reciprocal interactions, we continue co-evolving who we are and know of the world. I imagine that there is ever more something to gain about the thinking and knowing of other life forms and of our own human selves too. The amplified relations of the garden show that plants and arthropods and children share something in common. They partake in semiotic life. Their respective relationship to the world is mediated by the habits they follow, the patterns they trace among their objects of reference. What I've attempted to explore is what happens when they cross. First, a recognition of how human habits such as drawing exceed sociocultural contexts, and second, an appreciation for what is at stake when we fail to value such thinking beyond the human. Thank you.